Hello and welcome to the Red Leaf Card, your home for Canadian soccer news and views. My name is Jacob, and today we're going to be talking about the 2025 mid-season of the Canadian Premier League. But first, here's your fixtures rundown. Atletico Ottawa comes to a draw with Forge FC at 1 apiece. Pacific FC defeats Halifax Wanderers 3-2. York United defeats Valor FC 3-2. And Vancouver FC comes to a draw with Calgary FC of a scoreless match. And to talk about the 2025 midseason is Brandon Q from Canucks Abroad. Nice to having you.
Thanks for having me on, Jacob. Yeah, really excited to be on here, and thanks for inviting me.
So, looking at the 2025 season of the Canadian Premier League is becoming mostly like just we see in the province of Ontario, it's becoming just mostly a battle with two teams, but we don't know yet until the last 14 matches of the Canadian Premier League. So, like, what are your thoughts is of the next half of the season of the
Yeah,
2025 season?
yeah, it's going to be a really interesting fight to the end. You already mentioned Atletico and Forge at the top. They very much seem to be the two teams to beat this season. Um, Especially with Atletico only having a loss and Forge being unbeaten this season as well. So, yeah, to that point, it seems to be a similar storyline as we've seen from years past, where two teams seem to have that lead at the top, and one of them always seems to be Forge. But I'm sure Halifax, Cavalry, those supporters won't be too far behind. Seems to me that with the recent scoring troubles that Cavalry have had, they do seem to be tailing off a little bit. But I think a lot of people would say for sure that there's a divide that's starting to develop in the CPL when it comes to teams at the top versus teams at the bottom. We saw it a little bit last year. And for sure, we've seen it in years past with FC Edmonton, RIP. But yeah, again, it's just there's starting to be that little bit of a divide, even though the parity narrative is definitely still there. With how Valor and Vancouver's seasons have transpired so far, and even with Pacific, despite their win last week, they're still, fairly detached from that playoff line, as it were. York seemed to be that weird team in the middle that's neither really, challenging for top four, but they are a cut above the bottom three. And so, yeah, really interesting to see what the back half of the season will come to show.
So, like, let's just say, starting with Atletico Ottawa being the first place in the midseason, like, what do you think how they're doing, trying to stay on the top?
Yeah, I mean, they've done really well, I think, in the start of the season to be that energetic team that Diego Mejia promised Ottawa would be, especially after the seasons with Carlos Gonzalez at the helm, where we saw a little bit of that, direct, exciting play, but there were points in both of those seasons, and in fact, all three seasons that Cargo was in charge. If memory serves correct, it might have even been four, as it were, where they tended to back off a little bit. And so, with David Rodriguez having that hot start to the season, they've got good production out of Sam Salter. Even backing up into the midfield as well. There's been some solid development that I think the team have seen from players like Gabby Antonoro and Kevin Dos Santos. And so, they've seemed to weather the storm really well, especially after losing Amir Didic at the back. Um, it seems to, as much as he is a massive piece of that back line and of that locker room as a whole in terms of the leadership that he supplies, Kozlovsky, Cloutier, Abatne, the three of them have, and Tier Walker just add in as well. The four of them have really done a stellar job, if anything, of deputizing at the back. Despite basically being the youngest backline in the league, if not the youngest. Um, so yeah,
Yeah, you look at Atletico Ottawa right now. There's a lot of possible of like winning some of the awards for the Canadian Premier League. You have like the under 21 Canadian Player of the Year. You have Coach of the Year, and probably the MVP of the Canadian Premier League for 2025.
yeah. I mean, I think that's always going to be the case when you're number one in the league. You have to have good players and a good team and a good coach to be in that position for sure. But yeah, like you said, they are front runners in those awards for, a lot of the right reasons. They've got the goals, they've got the assists, they've got the progressive play that um, you've kind of needed in this league for a long time. I know the sort of excitement around that team at the start of the season, coming off the disappointment that was last season as well. So they're for sure moving in the right spot or moving in the right direction even.
Now, talking about Forge FC, the team has not lost a match with only Atletico Ottawa only lost a match. Do you think Forge FC could come back in the second half of the season?
I mean, we've seen in this league itself in past years that your lead is never guaranteed until the last day of the season, and even beyond that with respect to playoffs. So, I mean, for sure, they're only a point behind. Forge fans, Atletico fans will both hate me pandering towards them, but the fact that they are the unbeaten team in the league right now, again, drawing parallels to Liverpool in the Prem a couple of seasons back, where they finished the season second and unbeaten, or even Arsenal in the WSL last season finishing unbeaten, and despite that, still finishing second. They're in good company, I can say that much. And again, Forge have been that constant for a reason in the CPL, and that being that they've had the luxury of stability within their team. So, players like Ashnodi Johnson, players like even in goal, we saw a couple of weeks ago, Dino Bontis becoming the first keeper, last name not to be Henry Klelat or Kalongo, to play a game since 2021. And, you look to a Kyle Becker, you look to a Noah Jensen, who's now been there for a few seasons. You have, in your front three, there's still Forge, Chouanier, Babuli's come back to Forge. And so there's just a lot of that familiarity there that has been the reason why they've been at the top up until now, and a reason why that they're still there this season. So, a point behind is, with 14 games to go, very easy ground to make up. And for Ottawa, they are going to have to continue being, that pace setter for the league. That, last week's result, the 1-1 draw, really proved that both teams are kind of just, in an element right now where they're very stable, I think. Now, you have to kind of consider the fact that Forge maybe bunkered a little bit last week with, they don't often play that five at the back. I think Ottawa fans are probably the happier of the two groups, happy the two fan groups coming out of last week's 1-1 draw, given that they, even aside from the late penalty, just the fact that is kind of the marquee matchup, in the CPL right now.
And we went talking about, so we talked about Atletico Ottawa and Forge FC, but there's still the two teams that are close to the Canadian Championship Finals, like Forge FC upsetting Club de Foot Montreal, and Atletico Ottawa trying to get those easy rounds that they could have to the finals. But now Forge FC and versus Vancouver Whitecaps, and you have Atletico Ottawa versus Vancouver FC.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you mentioned Canadian Championship, and that has historically been the equalizer in the CPL season, I think, in terms of, it gives teams an opportunity to either get some rest if they're already out of the competition or build some momentum. But we've also seen it be sort of that killer of momentum in a lot of ways. And again, I think last week was a really good showing of that, where Vancouver got a really valuable draw out of Calgary in the league after getting that win in the Canadian Championship on penalties. And that's just going to go further in terms of trying to propel them up the table. How far they can go on the table is kind of an interesting conversation to be, but with Calgary, it's, I think, a showing of their sort of striker issue right now, where Tobias Warshevsky isn't really getting the service that he needs to be that out and out number 9. Calgary themselves have said as much. I believe it was Fraser Arid last week who made the comment about them. It's not just a Toby issue. It's an entire team issue. And so, to some extent, do they fall into that mid-table? I don't want to say obscurity, but that mid-table sort of black hole that seems to suck some teams in and then not let them go in a way. Because like you say, Wanderers, yes, they lost last week again, but they're still only 4 points back, as opposed to Calgary being 6 points back. Granted, they do also have a game in hand over the rest of the top 4, top 5, and so that gap could close. And what we're saying this week might become a moot point by next week if they make up that ground. So, I hate to harp on it and come back to it, but it's just going to be an interesting end or back half to the season in the CPL.
Yeah. You look at Wanderers, are they going to have like the hardest points to try to make the second spot or trying to get first spot?
I mean, again, it's not out of the picture, I think. How this season's transpired, I think Patrice Geyser has, shied a little bit away from the sort of stability that he's tried to instill in terms of the formation last season. I know that some fans think that's been to a fault in past years, where he's probably stuck too long to a certain formation or certain setup tactically, certain personnel. Seems to have migrated a little bit further away from that this year in terms of being open to flexibility and changing it up if needed. But I think the first half of the season has also proven that the 3 and the 4 spot between Wanderers and Calgary is, to some extent, I think, a competition between the two of them, if you're gonna force me to have a position on it. I think it was also clear from the start of the season as well that with Ottawa having the start that they did, it was very clear that they, I think, have ascended a tier in sort of the CPL power rankings. Not even power rankings, but if you had a CPL tier list, I think most people would have had Ottawa somewhere either in the bottom of that first tier or the top of that second tier, and on the balance of it, they're in that first tier right now. And I think the other three teams that would have made up that sort of, and I don't want to call it first, second, and third tier truthfully, but it's very clear that there's maybe a top four, top five, and then within that there's sort of a top two, maybe three. And carrying over from last season, there hasn't really been much of a shift in the makeup of that top five. Where there has been a shift is in the makeup of the top two or top three between each season, because Ottawa have ascended, and that sort of necessitates a team sort of falling below them. And that team, in some ways, this season has been Cavalry. Whether it's a factor of fatigue and injury. I know that if you look back at the start of the season, they lost Eric Kobza. Jesse Daly was out, and then eventually mutually terminated his contract with the club. You've got Tom Field, unfortunately, in injury flux, through portions of the season. Diego Gutierrez, who I think has been, an unsung hero in a lot of ways in terms of just the consistency that he offers. And Gutierrez not being available means that, you've had a guy like Max Peatgrass step in for Cavalry and do a really good role, or play to a really high standard, and fill in that role. But in ways of he's still learning the game, as it were, and doesn't necessarily offer you the experience, the veteran sort of attacking flair that a Sergio Camargo might, or even the sort of, I think it's to some to say that there's pieces, I think, where Cavalry are maybe lacking compared to an Ottawa, and so that's sort of why they've fallen into a sort of a middle ground with the Wanderers. Maybe you bring York into the conversation. Maybe they're sort of out on their own. Although again, last week in that 3-2 win, we maybe saw more of the York that the coaching team has expected in this, up to this point in the season. Mauro Stakio has made some really good points through the course of the season, that they focused on the performance more than the results. And the results are what the fans and I think what most people are going to look at, but the progression that we've seen from them, I think, is not completely there yet. But it makes it exciting for the second half of the season to see if they can sort of maintain and really push on with that sort of progression. Think of a guy like Kemba Cabato last week. You think of a guy like Stephen Yates, who unfortunately looked like he picked up a bit of a knock with his knee. They started to contribute to sort of the attacking strength of that team, to the point where it's not just Julian Altobelli scoring goals, which I think at the start of the season you saw Altobelli having to do a lot of that himself, or an Adonai Jareed having to do a lot of that himself, and Massimo Ferris having to do a lot of that himself. And have they given up a bit of defensive stability to do that? Yes. But they seem to at least be trending, horizontally, if not upwards, which hasn't necessarily, I think, been the case for some of these other teams, where they're just kind of stagnant, if I can put it that way. So, yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned Calvary. It is always a question of Calvary FC that, like, their injuries, and now they have a new signing player just in the mid-season. What do you I guess, what do you think about the new signing that Calgary FC made?
With Gauthier and Tigny, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag for me, to be honest. From the perspective of, he is a great talent in terms of what this league has, turned out in past seasons. The unfortunate part is seeing him not really get the time of day at Annecy. Relegated to the second team for a long stretch. There were whispers of and rumors of him leaving the club back in January, and it has now happened this week. And it's unfortunate because you want to see those players kicking on in Europe and not coming back. In a way, you'd love to see them back in Canada, but you don't like seeing them back when they should be on that sort of upward trajectory, really developing their skills and potentially becoming, that kind of fringe Canadian men's national team player, even, a starter or a squad player, right? So, thinking of a guy like Dominic Zator, who has managed to carve out a path for himself in Poland, and you compare that to a guy like Tristan Borges as well, who excelled in his, the first half of his CPL career, went to Belgium, didn't really find the luck there at Leuven, and then ended up coming back. And, he's still Tristan Borges. But, in a way, not to be mean to these guys, you don't want to see them here in Canada because you want to see them having that success elsewhere. And I think, it's a great get for Cavalry. They're already familiar with the player. He'll offer something that, I think not a very similar profile, but some of the same skill set in terms of explosivity, being direct. And I hate to sound like a head coach or sporting director here, but Intigny just adds to sort of the firepower that they have up top with Ali Musi, with Jay Herdman, even Garen Senkov, who when he plays up at left wing. They all offer a piece that, circling back to that whole conversation about service to Borshevsky and really feeding the striker in him. Gauthier Intigny is a guy who can do that. And there's a reason why he went for, 400,000, 500,000 when he did. You just don't want to see him back in Canada because it means that there is, something that's gone wrong when he went to Europe. And that's the unfortunate part, I think, with seeing him here. But that, again said, he's here, and he'll be a very useful player, I think, for Calvary in the back half of the season. Again, just even if, fatigue and injury start to kick back in for the Cavs, Jay Herdman, I believe, has had, injury issues here and there throughout his career, just in terms of ankle, as much as every single winger seems to have throughout their career, just naturally, just given the fact of the position. But Ali Musi has had some very significant time off in his CPL career, and so it's just more options, which Calgary have always been that very deep team, and Intigny just adds to that.
So, do you think that Calgary FC coming into the second half of the season will make a comeback to the top three?
For sure. And I mean, top three, if that's the question, then, absolutely, in the sense that they're only 2 points back from the Wanderers. This table could probably flip-flop at least, 4 or 5 more times come the end of the season. I don't think this is our final table. I think you'll see some teams moving up and down as you get to the tail end of the season, and that'll make it really interesting for the playoff race, in terms of who has home field advantage, who's going to have to go through that lower bracket. Atletico and Forge very well do seem to be that top two. But I think you could make the case for both the Wanderers and Cavalry coming third. Halifax has seemed to work out some of their early issues in fits and starts. TMG possible shout for, defender of the year at the back for Halifax, as core as a player he's been. And they're starting to get that familiarity in that forward group with Sean Rea, Giorgio Probo, Ryan Telfer, and Thiago Coimbra. That they started to play off each other a little bit. Wanderers did fall to Pacific on the road, but even that game, I think, had some very exciting moments. Like I said, Thiago Coimbra finding the back of the net off an assist from Weston Teo, who's another player that has very quietly been very reliable at left back for not just Halifax, but Edmonton in the past. And then, you've got a Thiago Coimbra who's also now picked up an assist in that same game on Yohan Baye's goal, and Baye himself as well, just to add to that group. Halifax have, got those sort of 5 or 6 players in that forward group. It's now just a matter of, can they all keep clicking, which hasn't always been the case in this league. And again, not just for Halifax, but every single team. CPL, for as much as it is very much a consistency competition, I think, in terms of, you don't really win by having streaks where you're really good, because those are always cut in with streaks where you're really bad. Whereas how Forge managed to stay at the top for as long as they have, consistency. We saw Ottawa dip a little bit last season, I think in part because some of the tactics might have gotten stale, but they've been really consistent this year, and that's what has them at the top of the league. And so it's a bit cliche, but being consistent is really the easiest way to stay at the top of the league, just by virtue of the points and the production that you'll get from being a consistent team.
Yeah. So I know York United now in that last spot for the playoffs, which is the 5th spot. What do you think York United has performed this half of the season?
So York is, again, I think that team where you've seen the progression, but you just haven't seen the results. And there seems to be one of those teams every single year in the league where they do well enough to finish 5th, and they've had the performances, here and there to finish higher, but they just haven't closed out games, or they haven't started well enough in games. And so they dig themselves into a hole that they're just not able to dig themselves out of. Again, last week against Valor, that was a really interesting game where York scored 3 goals right around halftime, which is a time of the game where they don't usually score, or haven't usually scored this season. And yet, they still started the slower of the two teams, in the sense that Valor managed to get, that first half goal. And then coming back in to the second half, you saw towards the end, they started to slow down a little bit, York. And that allowed Miles Morgan to pull them within 1. And they were knocking on the door towards the end, for that equalizer. And I think a lot of York fans can be forgiven for thinking that they were going to end up with another 3-3 draw. That, probably helped Valor a bit more, or would have helped Valor a bit more than York. It doesn't really make a difference in terms of how far the gap is between Valor and York had that ended in a draw. But it would have, I think, given Valor just that little bit more confidence, because now they end up coming out of a really good Canadian Championship performance against Vancouver Whitecaps, only to lose. And they've come out of another solid enough performance that I think against the teams around them would have gotten Valor a win. But, with giving up 3 goals right around halftime, I don't have the statistics on me right now, but I would hazard a guess and say that whenever you give up 3 goals to a team, you're probably not winning in the CPL. Offhand, I can only think of a few times that a team has won while giving up 3 goals. And, as much as Valor have sort of pushed on in the last two games, now they've become that team that isn't getting the results uh, for the performances that they've put in.
Yeah, yeah. York United kind of showed their performance really well against Valor FC, but it looked like a matchup that could have been a draw match. But like right now, York United is staying in fifth spot, and it's always the question is, can York United hold it up of being in the playoffs?
Yep, that's their kind of, not golden goose, sorry. It's it's what they've fallen short from in the past few seasons where, it's always good. We're in the playoffs. Now what? Seems to be the question. And I mean, Mora tried to turn that page last season with, winning that home game only for them to end up on the road and ultimately drop that sort of disappointing loss on penalties in the quarterfinal against Ottawa. Or, if you hark back to 2 years ago, same story. They beat Pacific, or sorry, they beat, it would have been Vancouver, or sorry, not Vancouver. They would have gone to Pacific in the play-in last year, or 2 years ago, gone to the play-in against Pacific, and had that really disappointing late loss, where Adonijah Reed, who now plays for them, scored against them in stoppage time, and you had that Paris G bicycle kick that God, had that gone in, that would have been great. But you end up with a team that, although they've technically made progress by going losing the play-in round 2 years ago to winning the play-in round, but now losing the quarterfinal last year, you would want to see them at least repeat that performance, if not better it. And I just, at this point in the season, I mean, I think their playoff position is safe. Now, that's notwithstanding some of the rumors around acquisitions that Pacific are looking to make this summer. And we've definitely not seen the last of teams in fifth place, trailing off right as the sixth place team starts to pick up towards the end of the season. So, I don't think York's position in the playoffs is guaranteed by any means, but they do seem the best equipped at the moment, compared to a Pacific, a Valor, a Vancouver, just by virtue of that lead that they do have over the bottom three clubs. They went out and signed a Julian Altobelli, who, again, it seems absurd now that TFC let him go, or TFC2 let him go after finishing last season with 7 goals in 7 games consecutive, and then for him to start this season with 5 more. He didn't score in that. There was one game in there that he didn't score, but for the rest of the time, it was basically a goal per game, which has since trailed off a little bit. But again, he was back in the goals last week, and he's been that sort of striker that the club have lacked over the last few years, whether that role fell on the shoulders of Austin Ricci, whether that fell on the shoulders of Brian Wright, who again scored quite a few goals for the club, but just in terms of consistency, maybe in the lineup is where he got the short end of the stick with the rotation last year, where I think York have strengthened in Altobelli, and then even with the news today that they've picked up Sean Hundle from Valor, with Marky Wojciechowski going back the other way. Do I think Hundle's going to play a large role this season? Probably not, just with the way that Altobelli has been their guy for this full season so far. But Hundle is another one who I think comes in that sort of Brian Rosa role, where he'll get the minutes at the ends of games to keep Altobelli fresh, which benefits both himself and Altobelli and the team, because the more freshness you have in Altobelli, and the more ultimate minutes you can get in the end, will make them a stronger side And, Hundle himself has had ups and downs in the CPL, but there's still a solid finisher in there that, if York can unlock, then it just, again, gives them more options. Uh, gives an opportunity for Adonijah Reed and Massimo Farron to not have to log as many minutes as they have this season. Rotation wise, I think York have kept probably even their front seven very consistent. We've probably seen more rotation at the back, honestly, from York in terms of, week to week. Do you have a Frank Sturring in to play, or do you have, a Luke Singh? Osvaldo Leon has had a lot of minutes, but then you look to his left, Orlando Botello and Riley Ferrazzo have swapped out a lot. Max Ferrari's largely been benched for stretches this season in place of Riley Ferrazzo. And so, if not the front seven, then I think at least the front five, if I can call it that. Basically, your center mids, your attacking mids, and your striker have been very consistent for York this season. And again, at the back, you have a guy like Elijah Adakubi, who was unavailable last week for a yellow card accumulation suspension. And the role that, he comes in as a leader at the back at the cost of more rotation at the back. And so it makes for some really interesting calculus for that squad in terms of if they can find that gear to kick into to sneak into the conversation for third and fourth, which I think they're a lot more closer to that conversation than unfortunately the bottom three are to the conversation of being in the playoffs this season. Valor and Vancouver, it'll be a hard time for them.
Yeah. So I know now we see the teams that are trying to get their ways to the playoffs. Pacific FC right now in 6th spot with 12 points, which they defeated already Halifax Wanderers. Now the last two, Valor FC, which they just lost to York United, and also Vancouver FC, who drawed with Calgary FC. It is like, what do you think those three teams, which team might improve to try to make it to the playoffs for the last 14 matches?
You see, the thing is, all of these three teams have some really good people, and so, and by people I mean, personalities in the locker room. I'm sure, with staff as they are, head coaches are all really nice people, and so it sucks to talk about them in this way to some extent. But I think if you had to pick one team that would have the best shot at getting themselves into that conversation, I think you do have to some extent go with Pacific in 6th. Partially just the pure fact that they are 4 points closer to the playoff line than Valor and Vancouver, but also for the fact that Jan Twilly's hat trick this weekend will definitely be that sort of momentum that they've needed. Goal scoring, which seemed to be a real problem for them at the start of the season, lacking a true striker at times. They got Emmanuel Montejano in for a little bit, and he's now back on the bench in place of James Merriman trying to play some wingers at striker, which Valor have also tried to do this season. And I think Pacific have seen in the last 2 weeks between that 4-4 draw against Vancouver and last week against Halifax that they seem to be having a moment right now with the goals. It's 7 goals in the last 2 games. They do have a tough game coming up at Forge tomorrow evening, but they've got 6 home games left to go, if I'm not mistaken. And then the rest of their games on the road I think balance very nicely with the rest of their schedule. Um, and with the incoming rumors of Alejandro Diaz swapping Vancouver FC for Pacific again, and crossing that sort of BC divide back in the other direction, I think Pacific have started to work things out a little bit. Started the season, I think there were a lot of questions around just, who starts, who plays at almost every single position. I think maybe the few positions that you knew would be a lock in would be Bustos on the right side of that sort of 4-3, Josh Hurt on the left, and the same for Mukumbilwa and Caden Chung. But they've now gone to a 3-back, which seems to be the in vogue formation for half the league. And Jan Twali got that hat trick last week, and a fourth against Vancouver the game before. If you have a guy like Alejandro Diaz coming into that role where he's succeeded before, I think there's something to say about trying to reignite that Alejandro Diaz that had a great first half of the season left and still won the Golden Boot despite not playing the final 7 or 8 games this season, the year that he won it. So if Pacific do truly get that Diaz goal or Diaz deal over the line, which seems likely at this point, I think they probably have the best shot at kicking on and making the playoffs. Not to count Vancouver and Valor out, because I think the second you make that mistake, especially for teams in this league, that if you treat Valor and Vancouver without sort of the due respect that they do need, they can catch you up. Because we even saw it this week at York Lions Stadium, where Valor, for all of their struggles with locking a 9, an out-and-out striker, we've seen sort of Kian Williams play that role. We've seen Javonte Lane play that role. We've seen, I think on paper, technically, Xavier Venancio, you can play that sort of striker role. They've had sort of a rotating crew play that striker role, kind of similar to Pacific, but for a much longer time. And I think they've gotten less goals out of it. And, hard to say if the deal for Markey will make that difference for them, or whether they see him more as a depth backup option behind, like Kian Williams or a Figueiredo or Venancio, whoever's in that 10 role. People that count out Valor and then count out Vancouver, who again drew twice to Cavalry, and Cavalry is supposed to be, that consistent, stable, third place finish, if not better. You can slip up really easily in this league and let other teams in the door, is I think the point that I'm trying to get to. Not as much to draw parallels from NSL. There's not as much parity as there has been in the NSL this season. That we've seen from teams consistently beating each other. I think there's less, but still that happening in the CPL, where teams are still able to beat each other, or any team is able to beat any other team on their day. We just have seen fewer of those days across this league for the underdog team.
Yeah, like we usually see like some of the teams that are on the bottom, like the underdog. It's kind of hilarious of looking at Vancouver FC, of the quote that the head coach Ashvin said that from the press conference, like that, like what was, and it was put it on a T-shirt, like from the fans. It went viral from the Canadian Premier League. Remember Brandon, that.
Yeah. The quote from Gopi, I believe, if I'm quoting correctly, was best last place team in the league in league history.
Like,
And you're right. It's kind of hilarious in a way, but I
like
think I
it's
pick into that quote a little bit more because I don't know if they are the best worst team in the league. I think they're the most exciting because I think we've seen from past seasons that Edmonton under Alan Koch when the season unfortunately when they folded were again they were opportunity FC for a reason. I think in the sense that they might not have had the talent and the funding that other teams in the league might have had that season. But, there's, I think, a time and place for pragmatic coaching. And, you know, I love Allen. Allen's a great guy. He was able to give that to an Edmonton side that I think lacked um, a direction. And again, not to any player's fault and not to any staff's fault. I think just the circumstance that they were in that season. Um, Allen really gave them sort of the direction that they needed to get as many points as they did and put as many points on the board. They finished with the wooden spoon that season, but it wasn't that far off from them finishing seventh. It ended up being 9 points to Halifax, who finished seventh that year.
yeah. I think that like the best last place team for Vancouver FC, but you can't like I think that might not be a good view on Vancouver FC because right now Vancouver FC are the semifinalists right now in the Canadian Championship and they're doing really well. They've like made the upset against Calgary FC, which they like a lot of people thought Calgary FC was gonna go to the semifinals, but you have right now the last place team in the semifinals versus Atletico Ottawa, and might be another upset.
Yeah, that's I think the magic of the cup playing in a little bit. I think there's also something to say about with Vancouver FC's season as it has been so far. Are they looking to some of those cup games and the excitement around potentially being in that semifinal, potentially being in that final, as extra motivation that they wouldn't otherwise have in the CPL? Because I mean, on face value, just based on their league season so far to the halfway point, they are on track to become the worst, not on track to become the worst last place team in the CPL. That's a margin that might not be met for some time, but they are on. They aren't necessarily on pace to beat the points finish that Edmonton got in 2022. Just pulling it up in the background here, Edmonton finished that season with 20 points and a negative 20 goal differential. Vancouver currently sitting on 8 points and minus 12. So, if the first half of their season, or if the first half of the season, how it's gone for Vancouver is how their second half goes, on paper, they won't be the best worst place team in the CPL by a decently long shot. But yeah, you're right in the sense that, where they have been really good is that Canadian Championship magic of the cup, excitement around it sort of scenario where they do have, again, feels unfortunate to say it this way, but they have something to play for in the final or in the sense of getting to that final, potentially even winning it. Just the fact that they've even gotten to the semifinal so far, and to defeat Calgary over 2 legs, I think is something that people probably wouldn't have expected at the start of the season. And by wouldn't, I mean, I think it's fair to say that if you pull the receipts, I think most people and possibly all people didn't think that would happen. So, yeah, to that sort of extent, it makes for some very interesting reading when you consider that Vancouver have also gotten to where they are in the Canadian Championship semifinal on 3 consecutive 1-1 draws. because if you hark back to May, at the start of May, they played Pacific to a draw and then beat them on penalties in the first round. And then both of their quarterfinal legs against Calgary have also ended in 1-1 draws. And so, can they buy a 1-1 draw against Atletico Ottawa? Maybe. That one seems a little bit less likely, given where Ottawa are in the standings. But there's nothing to say that, if Ottawa, again, they could very easily slip up, I think, if they don't necessarily focus on the game. Which isn't to say that they've done that this season, because I think they've done really well at starting and closing out every single game that they've played. But yeah, I think it's an interesting argument whether getting to where they have gotten to in the Canadian Championship this season and the teams that they've beat, does that make them a better last place team than we've seen in the history of this league? And again, just to even remember back to last year, Halifax and Vancouver finished 2 points ahead of Valor. So in terms of the conversation of, is Vancouver the best worst place team in the league? They've won less games than they did last year. So
yeah.
Can you really be better in that scenario? And I think for some people the answer is no.
Yeah. Well, we'll hope. The next half of the season goes well in the 2025 Canadian Premier League, and see what happens. Some shocking moments or any changes happens. And that's full time of the Red Leaf Card. You can follow us on X, Spotify, and YouTube. I'm your host, Jacob, subbing out.